I'm Joe Lichtenberg, and it really is a privilege to be presenting to all of you talented innovators and founders today. And thank you all for coming to our READY conference. What I plan to talk about over the next 30 minutes is why, even if you have the greatest technology in the world, and I'm sure many of you in this room do, the reality is that tech is usually only half the battle that's required to build out a successful company. So that's really what I want to talk to you about today. So before I get started, a little bit about me. I've been working in the enterprise software space for more than 40 years now. Hard to believe. I am currently the Director of Product and Industry Marketing at InterSystems. I've been with InterSystems now for almost 10 years. I actually started my career as an engineer. So I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in engineering. And I've worked with many different enterprise technology companies. I've done 5 startups as VP of marketing or VP of product marketing. I've worked with larger established companies as a full-time employee. And I also spent about 10 years as a strategy consultant working with more than 20 different B2B technology companies. So I've seen a fair amount over the course of my career. And what I'd like to do in this session is try to share with you some of the more important and I think relevant lessons that I've learned over the years. So I hope that this session is interesting and useful for you. I'd like to be able to tell you that I learned all of what I'm going to talk about by doing everything right, but of course that's not true. And the reality is it's more like the opposite. So I've seen and I've personally made lots of strategic mistakes over the course of my career. And, I think very often those are the ones that have taught me the most. And at least I'd like to think I'm in good company. Here's a quote from our founder, Terry Reagan, who said he's learned more from his failures than from his successes. So again, I feel like I've seen a lot over the course of my career, and my hope is that some of my experiences that I'm going to talk about today will help some of you or most of you make good strategic decisions with your businesses. Okay, so here's the agenda of what I'll take you through over the next 30 minutes or so. In the interest of time, I'll just let you read this slide. Okay, so let's start by talking about strategy and why it's so important. So here's the bad news. On average, most startups are not successful. And they usually fail not because the technology doesn't work, but from making some poor strategic decisions. And one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen, and it's usually made by technical founders, is falling in love with your product instead of falling in love with solving a problem. Building something with really good technology that just not enough people want to buy. So step one should always be about being really clear about what problem you're solving, and also being really, really clear about who you're solving it for. So, I've personally been in a number of war rooms with management teams where we built something that we think is really powerful. And we're all sitting around the table brainstorming around where we should take it in the market, which is the exact opposite of the approach you want to take. You don't want to build a product in search of a problem. You want to start with solving a specific problem for a specific persona. So again, step one should be to clearly define what problem you're solving. Then number two, you should be really clear on who is feeling the most pain from not solving that problem. And there are lots and lots of books and resources on defining personas. One book that I really like, it's called The Inmates Are Running the Asylum. And there's other resources. There's firms like Buyer Persona Institute, a firm that I've worked with multiple times. They'll go out and do primary research for you and do surveys for you. And there are lots of other resources that can help you with defining your target personas. Right. I've seen some people define personas like Julie, who drives a minivan. She has 3 kids. I never did that. But what I did do is I tried to be really clear about the professional characteristics of my key target or my key persona. What's their title? What responsibilities do they have? Who do they report to in the organization, and so forth. Then number three, it's really important to quantify the pain, right? We have a saying, big pain means a big deal. Little pain means you have a little deal, or maybe you have no deal at all. So what's the pain? Who experiences it the most? And then quantify the impact of not solving the problem, right? So what happens if they don't solve a problem? Does it incur additional costs? Does it put the company at risk of losing customers? Are there regulatory risks? Are there other risks like security risks? Does your champion in the account risk not getting their bonus at the end of the year? Or worse, do they get fired, right? I've seen that. It's really important to understand the actual pain that the problem is causing, who's feeling the pain the most, and then to quantify the impact of not solving that problem. So I want to tell you a really quick story. We have a customer in the financial services space that before we started working with them, they built an in-memory equity trading platform to trade stocks and equities and so forth. And when trading values would spike unexpectedly, it would flood memory. It was an in-memory system, and it would drop trades, and it would go offline and go dark for minutes at a time. And so it was causing problems. It caused lost revenue that they could quantify. It caused damage to the firm's reputation. And the director who was in charge of that platform eventually got fired. So the pain was really clear. And our target persona, who was the new director who took the old director's job, pretty well understood that keeping his job depended on solving that problem, right? And then the last piece, number 4, is understanding how they currently solve the problem. Do you have direct competitors? Are they solving it with workarounds? Are they not solving it at all? And then what happens if they don't solve it now, right? If they can wait a year or two to solve it, then maybe that's a clue that it might not be an important enough problem for you to tackle. Okay, so again, don't start with the product. Start with solving a very specific problem for a well-defined persona. Think outside in, not inside out. So an example, everyone here knows Slack. The reason Slack was so successful wasn't because it had the best messaging technology. It was because they thought about a better way for distributed teams that were juggling all multiple different disconnected communication channels to get their work done, right? So that's what they focused on. Okay, so here's a really good exercise to document what we just talked about. And I do this all the time. So you want to create and document your positioning statement. And so here's the canonical template for that. So you start by defining your target customer. In the case of Slack, it's teams that need to collaborate more effectively. And their pain for Slack, their prospects or customers are frustrated by endless email threads and scattered communication tools. You want to define your product and the product category that you're in. And unless you have a lot of money to spend with Gartner or other analyst firms, you want to be in an existing product category. Define your key benefit, who are your primary competitors, and then a crisp definition of how you differentiate from them. And for those of you in the room, if you haven't already created your positioning statement, I really recommend going back and working on this with your team, because it really kind of forces you to think through the things that we just talked about and then get them down, document them. And then, in the future, it's always good to have this to go back to refer to if things start to go sideways, if they start to go off course. So it sort of keeps you on track. All right, I want to talk a little bit about market sizing. So the canonical way to do this is to size the TAM, the SAM, and the SOM. So the TAM, the total available market, which might be huge, right? The SAM, which is the serviceable available market, which is just the segment that you can realistically serve. And then the SOM is the serviceable obtainable market, which is where you start. And in this session, I'm going to talk a lot about starting by focusing exclusively on a really, really narrow market segment before you try to scale. right? And that's your SOM, that's your initial serviceable, obtainable market. And that's actually one of the more common mistakes that I see startups make, which is starting out with way too broad of a target market. So the narrower your initial target market, the more likely that you're going to be successful. And why is that? Because now you're solving a very specific and a very narrow problem for a very specific and narrow target audience that all have the same problem, right? And it usually makes everything easier. Your product roadmap, your value prop, defining your target persona, your messaging, your go-to-market strategy, right? Narrower is always better. Then once you are successful and you dominate in this narrow segment, then you can start to broaden your aperture and scale. So on the bottom right, here's an example. Today Airbnb is at 12 billion in revenue, and they're still growing at 10% year over year, and they're everywhere. But the way that they started with a really narrow niche. So they started by just offering alternative rental housing for people that were attending technology conferences in San Francisco. That was it, right? That was their initial SOM. Then over time, they scaled to event attendees throughout the US and the rest of the world and so on, until really they became pervasive, right? So, the message here is start narrow, dominate and own a very narrow market niche, right? And then you can think about scaling. All right, I want to talk a little bit about competition. I think it's really important to do the deep research to really understand what your competitors offer and to be really clear about how you differentiate, right? So there's sort of three classes of competition. You have direct competition. So if you talk about Airbnb, that's probably rental listings on Craigslist, right? And then you have indirect competition for Airbnb, that was traditional hotels, right? But then you should also think about the status quo, which are like workarounds and people who are doing nothing. So for Airbnb, that would be day trippers that don't need lodging, right? And people that just don't go to an event because they don't want to have to deal with lodging, right? So I think the trick is to look at all of these three different classes of competitors, the direct, the indirect, and the status quo. And then number one, make sure you're differentiated and you have a clear and superior value prop for each one of these categories. And then number two, it also helps you to think about how to best target and attract the prospects that are in each one of these different categories. So one of the best books that I've read, I go back. So one of the best books that I've read on competition is this one. It's called Blue Ocean Strategy. And where there's lots of competition, there's lots of sharks feeding in the water. So the water is red with blood, right? And so what you want is you want to find the blue ocean where the competition is not so intense and the water is not so red and bloody, right? But, the reality now is that pretty much all markets, if they're interesting, are pretty saturated, right? And it can be hard to find an area where you're not going to have a lot of existing competition. But here's the good news. I actually think that we're at an inflection point in the market right now that doesn't come around very often. And that's by leveraging generative AI and agentic workflows to create new solutions in areas that up to now were pretty saturated with existing legacy competitors, but these technologies really are a game changer. And so this white paper that I read recently is really good. So it's a survey, it's a white paper, but it's presenting a survey from MIT NANDA. So NANDA is an acronym for Networked Agents and Decentralized AI, right? So it's about Gen AI and agents. The main takeaway from the paper and the survey is that the startups that leverage Gen AI and agents that go narrow and deep, that fully automate a very narrow and specific use case for a specific target user and persona, those are the companies that are most successful. So quotes from the paper, the best Gen AI startups focus on narrow but high value use cases They integrate deeply into workflows, and they scale through continuous learning rather than broad feature sets. Domain fluency, which is subject matter expertise, which I'm sure everybody in this room has, and workflow integration matter more than flashy UX, right? And so what they found was that solving a very narrow and specific set of tasks for a narrow target audience with Gen AI and agents really has the ability to disrupt the status quo. This is the SaaS apocalypse, or whatever they call it, right? That people are talking about now, right? And it's happening, right? And you can see on the slide a couple of examples that are from the paper around customer service and transaction monitoring. But there are lots of examples now, and there are lots of examples, especially in healthcare, where this works. So I really do think that we all have this rare opportunity now where we can disrupt existing markets, right? Where there were red oceans with legacy software products, right? By building new solutions that leverage Gen AI and agentic workflows. All right, so then very quickly, I want to talk a little bit about product market fit, what it is, how to attain it, and how you know when you have it, right? So getting product market fit right is really, really critical in the early stages of a company, and why it's so important that we start with a really narrow target market. And you'll know when you have product market fit, when it feels like the market starts pulling your product from you instead of you having to sort of push it or force it on the market. And so what does that look like? So it's not just initial downloads or initial sales. What does your telemetry data tell you? Are your users using the product? How much time are they spending on it? What parts of the product are they using? Are they referring it to their peers? Are they renewing? Are they willing to pay your asking price and they're not asking for deep discounts, right? And so on, right? And so how do you get to product market fit? Right. I mean, the reality is it's almost always going to involve a lot of sort of testing and iterating, continuous cycles. And the reality is that almost no one gets it right out of the box. Right. There's a famous quote that no business plan survives first contact with the customer. My favorite quote is from Mike Tyson, who said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Right. Getting to product market fit is almost always going to be this iterative cycle. So you build out your MVP. And we'll talk about that. Test your ideas with your target market. Listen to their feedback, and then be prepared to iterate or pivot, right? Again, the key is don't fall in love with your product. Fall in love with finding the best way to solve your customer's problem, and then be really flexible. Keep testing and iterating on your MVP until you feel like you start to get product market fit, and the friction starts to melt away. So to really, really quickly, I know most of you are past the MVP stage, but I want to talk a little bit about it. So here's the thing. The MVP should not be about building out Rev 1 of your product or building out the first half of your product roadmap. The goal of the MVP should be to allow you to test your approach to solving the customer's problem. And by the way, it doesn't have to be working code, right? It could be mockups, it can be storyboards, it can be something that you vibe coded that's not real. Right. And again, I know most of you are probably past this stage, but really the goal here is to have something that you can put in front of your target market that allows you to get feedback on your approach so that you can learn and iterate before you get too far down the path of building out your product. Right. And the reality is when you have a lot of sunk effort and sunk costs invested in building it out, it just makes it harder to pivot. Right. So think about the minimum that you need to test your idea, and then be flexible when you get feedback from the market. Okay, so ideally, now you've tested your idea, you've iterated, and now you have product market fit for this initial narrow target market. So how do you grow and scale? So this book, if I was in the room, I'd ask, for a show of hands. I'm sure many of you have read this book. This is kind of the marketing strategy Bible. It's Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore, right? And what you see on the screen, this is the bell curve for customer adoption, starting on the left-hand side. So your first customers are what he calls the innovators. And these are usually really technical people, right? They're the risk takers that are looking for the new thing, right? They like being on the forefront of what's new. And usually landing these innovators is usually the easiest, right? That's the good news. The bad news is there aren't enough of them for you to build a real company, right? So then the next segment, going from left to right, that you're typically going to close are what he calls the early adopters. And this group also likes to take risks and try out new products. But unlike the innovators, they're usually not very technical, but they will take a chance on something that's new if they like what you have, right? Okay, and then you see the chasm, right? So here's where it usually starts to get really hard, what Jeffrey Moore calls crossing the chasm. So what is that? That's the difference between selling to the early adopters and selling to the early majority. And this is a mistake that a lot of companies make, which is not recognizing that there's a really big difference between what's involved in selling to innovators and early adopters and what's involved in crossing the chasm to scale to the rest of the market. That next segment, the early majority segment, is far more practical and risk averse. And they usually need to be convinced that your solution really works. It does what you say it does. You already have successful customers that are getting benefits and so on, right? And so this is where things really start to change. You're going to need to have a lot more proof points and evidence to be able to sell into this early majority segment. You need to have a lot of documented customer successes. You need customer references. You need hard metrics. And you need these proof points to be able to show that your solution really works and it delivers the benefits that you say it does before they're willing to buy. And again, right, this is why it's so important to start with a very narrow focus so that you can gain success in this narrow market segment where the early majority can then interact with other successful customers that are just like them, that are peers in that same industry segment. Also from Jeffrey Moore in the same book is what he calls the Bullington strategy to scale out the business. So you start with a narrow market niche, you cross the chasm and you're successful, and then you scale in that niche first, right? But then you always want to be thinking about adjacencies that you can expand to once you successfully penetrate your initial target market. So one approach is you take the same product to adjacent market segments, right? So that's the Airbnb thing. So Airbnb, they're able to expand geographically and to market to more than just event attendees, but it was still the same product, right? So same product, take it to adjacent markets. A slightly different form of this strategy is to add new functionality to solve different problems, but sell it to the same account, your same customers. And a good example of that is HubSpot. If you're familiar with HubSpot, they started very narrow. They first started by targeting the marketing organization, then they expanded with adjacencies to sales, then services, then operations, all selling to the same customer, right? And that's classic platform expansion. Same customer, adjacent products that you can cross-sell and upsell. And then the advantage here is that it's usually much easier to sell more product to an existing customer than to close net new customers. But ideally, you want to do both. All right, so I want to take you through a real life example that I lived through. So I'm sure everyone here knows Workday, the company. At one point, recently, Workday had a $60 billion market cap. They went public more than 10 years ago in 2012, but the story actually starts around 2006 with a small company named Cape Clear Software. And I was working at Cape Clear Software in the early 2000s, and we were on the forefront of a brand new approach to integration software. It was this pure service-oriented architecture approach to ESB or enterprise service bus software. And it used a pure web services to expose data silos and applications and orchestrate them into these flexible workflows to solve all kinds of different technical and business problems. And it was a far better approach to integration than everything that came before it. And we were able to grow the company to 10 million in revenue. And then we stalled at 10 million in revenue. We were never able to cross the chasm to get from the early adopters to the early majority, right? And why was that? Well, there were a number of reasons, but one reason was that we were just too broad. We never focused on solving specific problems for a narrow market niche. So what happened? So Cape Clear got acquired by this brand new startup called Workday that nobody had ever heard of. And Workday, many of you may know this, they were founded by the ex-PeopleSoft management team. If you remember PeopleSoft, they were big HR, human capital management software vendors that got acquired in a hostile acquisition by Oracle. And when that happened, their management team left, and then that management team set out to build a PeopleSoft killer. So Workday took Cape Clear's technology, and they used it as the platform, the underlying platform, to build a better approach to HR and human capital management software to target PeopleSoft, right? PeopleSoft was legacy, it was client server, it was difficult to manage, it required lots of customization of sort of complex on-premise software, and Workday had a much better value prop. It was cloud native, it was multi-tenant, it was way more flexible, it was easier to customize and manage, right? Because of this underlying web services and service-oriented architecture, right? So what happened? Workday took this broad horizontal technology from Cape Clear, right? And what did? They applied it to solving a very specific set of workflows for a very specific target persona with a clear competitive advantage over the competition. Then what? Right? Then they used Jeffrey Moore's bowling pin strategy, and they scaled out with adjacencies. They added more modules for their existing HR users, and then they scaled to other departments in their existing accounts with different modules for things like finance and payroll and planning, right? And that's the story. That's how Workday took a horizontal technology from Cape Clear that stalled at 10 million in revenue, and they grew it 1,000x to 10 billion in revenue and a $60 billion market cap. So in the sake of time, I'm going to skip over a couple of these slides. There's different approaches to going to market and scaling. Product-led growth is all about having a viral product that people just download and use, and sales-led growth is a little more complicated, a little more expensive. If you can get to product-led growth, if you can build a product that goes viral, I highly recommend that you do that. That is not easy to do. I have more experience with companies that have sales-led growth and build sales organizations, but you have this slide and sort of different characteristics of the two. And then again, I won't go into Medic, but this is, at this point, it's used pretty pervasively across the entire tech industry. And Medic is an acronym. It's like a real-time GPS for your sales opportunities. This book is kind of the Bible, but there's lots of resources out there. If anybody's interested in learning more about Medic, I was actually with the company in the 90s called PTC, where we invented it. And Medic is an acronym. Again, start with the pain, identify and quantify the pain, and then make sure that you check all these other boxes. Okay, so a brief summary. You want to start small. Narrower is always better. Don't try to boil the ocean. Start by targeting a very, very narrow niche. Iterate until you get product market fit with your initial audience. Be successful in this narrow market niche first, right? Know that there's going to be a chasm between your early adopters and your early majority as you try to grow and scale, and try not to get stuck, right? Remember the Cape Clear and the story about taking a horizontal technology and what Workday was able to do by focusing on very specific problems and then growing with adjacencies, right? Once you cross the chasm, then you can work on scaling out with adjacencies using the bowling pin strategy. And some common pitfalls. And I think we talked about all these, right? No business plan survives first contact with a customer. Don't assume your idea is right. Keep testing and iterating, pivot if you have to, until you have product market fit, right? Go narrow, don't try to scale too early, and don't fall in love with your product. Fall in love with solving your customer's problem, right? That's the key. Okay, so here are some of the better resources that I've used in my career. I recommend all of these. And we don't have time today, but this is a really good workshop template that I've used in the past with success. And I welcome you to take this back and you can work on this with your team, right? So, and you can spend a day or a couple of days working through all these things. What's the specific problem you're solving? Who feels the pain? What does it cost them? Quantify the pain. What happens if they do nothing? What's your initial beachhead or target market or lead bowling pin? Are you going narrow enough and deep enough? Who's your competition? The 3 different categories of competition. Make sure you understand them, how you're different, how you're going to target those different users. Are you going to go to market via product-led growth or sales-led growth? How are you going to scale? You know, start narrow, but be thinking about the adjacencies so you can scale. And then, you know, where are you right now? Have you quantified the problem? Have you validated your solution to date? And talk about that and think about, right, is there more that you want to do to go back and validate that you're really solving the right problem? Okay, so there it is. I think I'm right at 30 minutes. I tried to share some of the more important lessons that I've learned over my 40 plus years in tech. I do hope that at least some of these will be useful for you in the work that you're doing. And I always really enjoy working with new people and learning about new companies. So if any of you would like to talk about what you're working on, or you have questions, or you just want to say hello, please feel free to reach out to me. I would love to talk to you and hear about what you're doing. So thank you all very much. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference.